The blizzard reached Lewistown just after midnight. At first, it sounded like distant thunder rolling across the plains. Then, the wind arrived. Not a howl, not a whistle, but a long, violent scream tearing across the Judith Basin. Snow slammed into cabins like thrown gravel. Roof beams groaned. Doors rattled against their hinges. Inside the settlement, lanterns flickered behind frosted windows as families woke to the sound of the storm tightening its grip. Men stumbled outside with shovels and numb hands, trying to clear the drifts piling against their doors. But the snow kept coming, faster, harder. By dawn, the storm had already broken its first roof. Somewhere in the dark, a beam cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. And then, the heavy, splintering collapse of timber. No one needed to ask what it meant. Another cabin had failed. That winter, most homes in Lewistown were made of pine logs cut from nearby hills. They burned wood all night just to keep the cold from creeping through the walls. But during a storm like this, wood could not keep up. The wind found every crack. The cold slipped through every seam. And the more wood a man burned, the faster his pile disappeared. Families began feeding their stoves like starving animals, log after log, hour after hour. Still the cold pressed closer. Still the wind screamed. But on the hillside north of the settlement, something strange was happening. Half buried in snow and earth stood a low, rounded structure most people in Lewistown had mocked all summer. It did not look like a proper home. Its walls were thick sandstone. Its roof lay under heavy sod and frozen dirt. From a distance, it looked less like a house and more like a mound rising from the hillside. The neighbors had called it many things: a grave, a foolish experiment, a widow's mistake. But while the storm battered the settlement below, that strange little shelter did not move. Inside it, the air was steady, warm, quiet. A small fire burned in a carefully angled stone firebox. Just 2 logs rested in the flames, not roaring, not devouring wood, simply burning, slow and steady. The heat moved differently here. It did not rush upward and vanish through a tall chimney like in the wooden cabins below. It settled. It soaked into the thick stone walls and spread through the room like a held breath. Eleanor Caldwell knelt beside the fire, her hands resting near the warmth of the embers. Her face was thin from hard seasons on the frontier, but her eyes were sharp and calm. She had been awake for hours, listening, feeling the storm through the stone. Up in the loft above her, 2 small shapes stirred beneath heavy quilts. Benjamin Caldwell woke first, 10 years old enough to know the sound of danger when it arrived with the wind. He sat up slowly. For a moment, he listened. The storm outside sounded like the world tearing itself apart. But inside the shelter, nothing moved. No rattling timbers, no icy draft crawling across the floor, just the quiet crackle of burning wood. Benjamin climbed down the short ladder and stepped beside his mother. "Is it the storm Walter warned about?" Eleanor nodded once. "It is." Benjamin looked toward the thick wooden door, now half buried under drifting snow outside. The wind struck it again, hard, but the shelter did not tremble. For a long moment, the boy said nothing. Then he asked the question that had been sitting in his chest all summer. "Are you sure the stone won't freeze us?" Eleanor placed another small piece of wood into the fire. Not a full log, just enough to feed the flame. She watched the fire settle before answering. "Feel the wall." Benjamin hesitated. Then he placed his palm against the sandstone beside the firebox. The stone was warm, not hot, not cold. Warm, the way sun-heated earth feels at dusk. The boy looked up at her. Outside, the blizzard roared harder. Another distant crack of collapsing timber echoed across the valley. Somewhere down in the settlement, another roof had given way. Benjamin swallowed. "People will freeze out there tonight." Eleanor's gaze moved briefly toward the storm, then back to the fire. "Some might, but not us." She rested her hand on the stone wall beside her. The same walls the neighbors had laughed at. Same walls Jacob Miller had called a grave. The same walls Benjamin himself had feared might become their tomb. Outside, the blizzard was tearing Lewistown apart. But inside, the strange little stone shelter on the hillside, the fire burned slowly. The walls held their heat. And for the first time in 3 winters, the Caldwell family was not afraid of the cold. What the neighbors did not understand yet was that this shelter had not been built by guesswork. It had been built with knowledge. Knowledge Eleanor Caldwell had carried across an ocean and refused to abandon. And before this storm was over, the entire frontier would learn why. The storm had not come by surprise. Not entirely. Walter Pritchard had warned the settlement days earlier. He was an old surveyor who trusted instruments more than rumors, and that afternoon he rode into Lewistown carrying a brass barometer wrapped carefully in cloth. Benjamin remembered the way the man's eyes looked. Not frightened, but serious. The kind of serious that made grown men stop joking. Walter dismounted in front of the small general store and checked the glass dial again. The needle was dropping. Fast. "Pressure's falling harder than I've seen in years," he told the men gathered on the porch. "A storm's coming. A big one." Most of them nodded politely. Frontier winters always brought storms. Men believed they understood them. But Walter shook his head slowly. Not like this. Benjamin had heard the warning while carrying water from the well. He watched the men exchange glances. Some laughed it off. Others simply shrugged. Storms came every winter. Cabins had survived them before. But the warning followed Benjamin all the way back up the hillside. The strange stone shelter stood behind him now, half tucked into the earth like an animal den. The walls were thick, the roof low, and the chimney barely rose above the sod. To most people in Lewistown, it still looked ridiculous. That afternoon, as Benjamin stacked another armful of firewood beside the door, a rider appeared on the trail. Jacob Miller, rancher, large, broad-shouldered, and known across the basin for believing he understood survival better than anyone. He reined in his horse and stared at the shelter. For a moment he said nothing. Then he laughed. "Still living in that stone grave, Mrs. Caldwell?" Eleanor stepped out of the doorway, brushing dust from her hands. She did not seem offended. "It keeps the wind out." Jacob shook his head. "You should bring the children down to the ranch before winter settles in." He gestured toward the shelter. "Stone traps cold. Everyone knows that." Benjamin felt his stomach tighten. Those words had followed them all summer. Stone freezes people. Stone holds the cold. Stone houses kill. He looked toward his mother, waiting to see if she would argue. But Eleanor only rested one hand against the wall beside her. "My father built homes like this in Cornwall," she said. "They stayed warm through winters far colder than ours." Jacob snorted. "Maybe in stories." Then he looked down at Benjamin. "Boy, when that storm comes, you'll wish you had real walls." Benjamin said nothing. He had wondered the same thing many nights. When the wind pushed against the hillside, when the stone felt too quiet, when doubt crept into his chest. What if everyone else was right? What if this shelter really was a mistake? Jacob tipped his hat and turned his horse back toward the settlement. As he rode away, his laughter carried faintly through the cold air. The sound stayed with Benjamin long after the rider disappeared. Inside the shelter, Eleanor moved calmly around the small room. She checked the firebox, adjusted the iron kettle, ran her fingers along the mortar joints between the stones. Every movement careful, every choice deliberate. Benjamin watched her for a moment before speaking. What if he's right? Eleanor looked up, not angry, not surprised, just thoughtful. Then she reached beneath the small wooden table and pulled out a worn leather journal. Its pages were yellow with age. Careful diagrams filled the margins. Measurements, notes, drawings of thick stone walls and angled fireboxes. She opened it to a page Benjamin had seen many times before. "My father wrote this when he was younger than Jacob Miller," she said. "He built shelters that stayed warm with a tenth of the fuel." Benjamin studied the sketch. Thick walls, low ceilings, earth packed against the back, a firebox built to throw heat back into the room instead of losing it up the chimney. "Stone remembers heat," Eleanor said quietly. "Wood burns fast and forgets." She closed the journal and placed it gently on the table. Outside, the sky was already darkening. Heavy clouds rolled low over the basin. The wind was beginning to rise. Benjamin walked to the door and pushed it open. The air outside had changed. Colder, sharper, the kind of cold that warned of something coming. Far below, small lights flickered in the settlement as families prepared their stoves for another long night. He imagined them stacking wood beside their fires, burning log after log to keep the cold away. Behind him, the stone walls held steady warmth. The fire burned slowly, patiently. Benjamin closed the door again. He looked at his mother, then at the thick sandstone walls surrounding them. Maybe the neighbors were right. Or maybe the storm would prove something none of them expected. Outside, the wind was already beginning to rise. November arrived early that year. The first snow came before most families in Lewistown had finished cutting their winter wood. At first, it was only a thin, white layer drifting across the plains. Beautiful, quiet. The kind of snowfall people welcomed after a long autumn of dust. But Benjamin had lived long enough on the frontier to understand something most children did not. Winter never arrived all at once. It crept closer, day by day. And when it finally struck, it did so without mercy. The stone shelter had been finished 3 months earlier. Benjamin and his mother had spent the late summer testing every part of it. They burned small fires to see how the heat moved through the walls. They sealed gaps in the mortar. They adjusted the iron damper in the chimney until the fire drew perfectly. Every change mattered. Every detail meant survival. On the first cold night of November, Eleanor lit the fire before sunset. Benjamin watched closely. 2 logs. Only 2. The flames burned slowly inside the angled stone firebox. The warmth spread through the small room in a way that felt different from the old cabin. Not sharp heat. Not the kind that vanished the moment the fire died. This warmth stayed. It rested inside the stone. An hour later, the logs had burned down to glowing coals. Benjamin expected the room to cool, but it didn't. The air stayed steady, comfortable, even. He pressed his hand against the wall again. Still warm. Lucy laughed from the floor where she played with her corn husk dolls. The girl had stopped coughing weeks ago. That alone felt like a miracle. Benjamin looked at his mother. It works. Eleanor allowed herself the smallest smile. Stone remembers. Word of the shelter had spread across the settlement, though most people still spoke of it with amusement. A few days later, Jacob Miller rode past again. This time, he slowed his horse when he saw smoke rising calmly from the short chimney. The wind had begun to pick up that afternoon. Cold air swept across the basin in sharp gusts. Jacob studied the strange mound of stone and earth. Then he called out, "You still planning to stay up here through winter?" Eleanor stepped outside. Snow dusted the ground around her boots. "We built it for winter." Jacob looked toward the sky. Dark clouds were rolling across the horizon like iron waves. Even he seemed uneasy. "Storm's coming," he said. "Bigger than most." Benjamin stepped beside his mother. He felt the wind bite through his coat. "You think it'll be bad?" the boy asked. Jacob gave a short laugh, though it held little humor this time. "Boy, every storm out here is bad." He leaned forward slightly in the saddle. "Bring the children down to my ranch before nightfall. I've got thicker walls than most." Eleanor shook her head gently. "We'll stay." Jacob stared at her for a long moment. The wind lifted the edges of his coat. Snow began to fall again, light at first. "This isn't pride," he said quietly. "It's survival." Eleanor's voice remained steady. "Exactly." Jacob's gaze shifted toward the shelter once more. The thick stone walls, the low roof pressed into the hillside. Something about it made him hesitate. But pride was a stubborn thing. Finally, he pulled the reins and turned his horse toward town. "Suit yourself." He rode away through the rising wind. Benjamin watched until the rider disappeared into the drifting snow. The sky darkened quickly after that. By late afternoon, the clouds had swallowed the sun entirely. The temperature dropped so fast, Benjamin could feel it in his lungs. Inside the shelter, the fire burned steadily. 2 logs again. No more. The stone walls held their warmth like living things. Lucy sat near the hearth, humming softly, while her dolls rested beside her. The quiet inside the shelter felt almost unnatural compared to the wind building outside. Benjamin stepped to the small window cut into the stone. Snow was beginning to move sideways now. The wind carried it in long white ribbons across the valley. Down below, the settlement lights flickered to life one by one. Families were feeding their stoves, stacking wood beside the fire, preparing for another cold night. Benjamin felt a knot of worry tighten in his chest. What if the storm is worse than we think? Eleanor placed another small log into the fire, The flames caught slowly. Then we will see if the shelter was built well. Outside, the wind began to roar. The storm that would change everything was finally arriving. By midnight, the storm had become something else entirely. Not weather, something alive. The wind slammed against the hillside with a force that made the earth itself seem to shudder. Snow no longer fell from the sky. It moved sideways, driven by the gale in long white sheets that erased the world beyond the shelter. Inside, the stone walls did not move. The fire burned low and steady inside the angled firebox. 2 logs, just 2. Their flames flickered softly against the thick sandstone. Benjamin lay awake in the loft beside Lucy, listening. The storm outside sounded like claws dragging across the roof. He had heard blizzards before, but never like this. For a moment he wondered if Jacob Miller had been right, if no shelter could survive a storm this violent. Then he felt the warmth beneath the blankets, not fading, not thinning, steady, the way the earth feels when the sun has warmed it all afternoon. Benjamin climbed quietly down the ladder. His bare feet touched the wooden floor. The air inside the shelter felt calm, almost peaceful. Eleanor was already awake. She knelt beside the firebox, adjusting the iron damper. The flames shifted slightly as air moved through the chimney. "It's stronger now," Benjamin whispered. Eleanor nodded without looking up. "It will be." Outside, something crashed in the distance, a heavy, splintering sound that carried even through the roaring wind. Benjamin froze. "A roof," Eleanor said quietly. He knew she was right. Wood beams could only carry so much snow. The storm had been piling it higher for hours. Somewhere down in the settlement, another home had just lost the fight. Benjamin moved toward the door and placed his hand against the thick wood. The cold on the other side felt immense, like pressing against a frozen river. He pulled his hand back quickly. "How cold do you think it is?" Eleanor checked the small thermometer Walter had given them earlier that week. The mercury line had dropped far below the marks Benjamin recognized. 30 below, she said. Benjamin looked toward the fire. Just 2 logs burned quietly inside the firebox. He remembered nights in the old cabin when they had burned 6 logs before midnight and still shivered beneath blankets. Yet here, the air remained warm, even, safe. He pressed his palm against the north wall again. The stone felt warm beneath his hand, almost as if the hillside itself was holding heat for them. "Stone remembers," Eleanor said softly, noticing the gesture. Benjamin nodded. For the first time since the storm began, he believed it. The shelter was not fighting the storm. It was simply enduring it. Hours passed. The wind screamed across the basin without rest. Snow continued to slam against the door and pack itself against the walls outside. But inside the shelter, time moved slowly. The fire burned down to glowing coals. Eleanor added one more log. Just one. The flames rose again, gentle and steady. Benjamin climbed back into the loft and tried to sleep. The storm outside raged like a wild animal, but the stone walls held firm. No drafts crept across the floor. No beams groaned. No snow slipped through the roof. For the first time in years, winter could not reach them. Sometime near dawn, the wind changed. Not weaker, just different. And through the storm came a new sound. A dull, heavy pounding. Benjamin's eyes snapped open. 3 knocks, slow, desperate, from the door below. Benjamin sat upright in the darkness. For a moment he thought the storm itself had struck the door. But then it came again. 3 more blows, weaker this time. Someone was outside, in the middle of the worst blizzard Lewistown had seen in years, trying to reach the shelter the whole frontier had laughed at. The knocking came again, weak this time, almost swallowed by the wind. Benjamin was already halfway down the ladder when Eleanor reached the door. Snow had piled against it from the outside. When she pulled the latch and pushed, the door opened only a few inches before the drift stopped it. A blast of frozen wind rushed into the room. For a moment, Benjamin could see nothing but swirling white. Then, a shape collapsed forward through the narrow opening. A man, covered in snow and ice. Eleanor pulled him inside while Benjamin forced the door shut again. The storm vanished instantly behind the thick stone walls. Only the quiet crackle of the fire remained. The man lay trembling on the floor. His beard was stiff with frost. Ice clung to his coat and shoulders like broken glass. Benjamin recognized him immediately. Walter Pritchard. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Eleanor knelt beside him and began brushing snow from his coat. "Blankets," she said calmly. Benjamin hurried to the bed and dragged 2 heavy quilts back across the room. They wrapped Walter tightly and eased him closer to the fire. "Slow breaths," Eleanor told him. "Do not rush the warmth." Walter's hands shook violently as feeling began returning to his fingers. For several minutes he could not speak. Only the sound of the storm outside and the steady fire filled the shelter. At last he managed a whisper. "I knew." He swallowed painfully. "I knew the stone would hold." Benjamin poured a cup of warm water from the kettle and held it carefully to the man's lips. Walter drank slowly. Color began to return to his face. "My cabin collapsed," he said hoarsely. "Roof gave way just after midnight." Benjamin glanced toward the door. Somewhere beyond the snow and wind lay the settlement. Families fighting the storm inside wooden walls, burning through their firewood as fast as they could. Walter looked around the shelter in disbelief. His eyes moved across the thick stone walls, the calm fire, the quiet air. Then he looked back at Eleanor. "How warm is it in here?" Eleanor reached for the thermometer. The mercury line rested steadily near the middle of the glass. 68 degrees. Walter stared at it. Outside, the storm still raged in darkness. 30 below, perhaps colder. Yet inside the shelter, the air felt like early autumn. He shook his head slowly. Incredible. Benjamin added another small log to the fire. Just one. The flames caught easily. Walter watched the simple movement with astonishment. "How much wood have you used?" Benjamin thought for a moment. 4 logs since yesterday morning. Walter closed his eyes briefly. At last, he spoke again. "My stove burned 20. The difference hung in the warm air between them. Stone walls, 2 feet thick. Earth packed against the hillside. A low roof that trapped heat instead of losing it. Every decision Eleanor had made months earlier now revealed its purpose. Morning finally arrived. The wind had begun to weaken. The blizzard no longer screamed across the valley. Now it moaned like a tired animal fading into silence. Benjamin opened the door carefully. Sunlight reflected off endless white snow. The world looked buried. Cabins below sagged under heavy drifts. Smoke rose thinly from chimneys where families still fought the cold. Word spread quickly through the settlement. Walter Pritchard had survived the night in the strange stone shelter on the hillside. By afternoon, the first visitor arrived. Then another, and another. Men stepped inside cautiously, stamping snow from their boots. They expected cold stone. Instead, they found warmth. Steady, even, almost unbelievable. Jacob Miller came last. He stood in the center of the shelter, hat in his hands. The same man who had laughed all summer. Now he ran his palm slowly along the sandstone wall, feeling the warmth stored deep inside the stone. "I burned nearly 100 logs during that storm," he said quietly. "And we were still cold." Benjamin pointed toward the small fire. 4 logs sat beside the hearth, their entire supply for the day. Jacob looked at them, then back at Eleanor. "I was wrong." The room fell silent. But Eleanor did not smile. She only nodded once. "Now you know." Jacob took a slow breath. "Will you teach us?" Benjamin watched his mother for a moment. Then she placed her hand once more against the stone wall. The wall the settlement had called a grave. The wall that had held their heat through the worst storm of the winter. Of course. Because stone remembers heat, and knowledge, if it is shared, can keep an entire frontier alive.